Entretanto, gostaria de vos apresentar o Nathaniel Carroll, que vem de uma organização internacional, portanto, que tem sede nos Estados Unidos, que é Forest Trends. Ele é diretor, portanto, de um projeto que se chama Ecosystem Marketplace, aliás, do Biodiversity Markets, que pertence a um projeto maior que se chama Ecosystem Marketplace. O Ecosystem Marketplace eu conheci-o através da internet e, portanto, achei muito interessante, já conheci há algum tempo atrás e já tinha desenvolvido alguns contactos e, portanto, agradeço muito a sua presença. Portanto, o Nathaniel vai-nos falar exatamente de um dos, digamos assim, produtos que este projeto faz. Este projeto faz relatórios, faz webinars, seminários através da internet. Aliás, portanto, é fácil encontrar o Ecosystem Marketplace na internet, como eu disse, e, portanto, também procura disponibilizar estes recursos também para as empresas e, portanto, o Nathaniel vai-nos falar do estado atual dos mercados de ecossistemas e biodiversidade no mundo, portanto, a nível global. Obrigada.
Great. Well, thank you, Paula, and Marcus for inviting me and making it possible to join you guys today. And yeah, I think this actually will be perfect follow-on from Yust's presentation, where I'll sort of take over the market side of things. We don't focus that much on valuation, and to me those are the sort of two big focuses within ecosystem services. So I think it's going to be a good combination. I'm going to today try to probably divide my presentation into two pieces, sort of a facts and figures section where I'll do a status update on sort of what we're tracking and relatively cut and dry, and then I'll sort of try to pull some patterns and trends out of the data that we collect to sort of give us maybe some building blocks to think about later this afternoon in our workshops, and thinking about building biodiversity markets or ecosystem service markets in Portugal and Europe. So let me just take a few minutes to give you a little bit of background on the ecosystem marketplace, to give some context to the numbers that I'm going to show you. As Paula mentioned, we are just a piece of a larger international NGO called Forest Trends. We focus on news, data, and analytics around ecosystem services and markets for ecosystem services. Within Forest Trends, there's also a sort of implementation side and sort of convening communications side. And basically our goal is to increase the scale of conservation finance and the ecological outcomes of conservation finance. So first, the status and facts and figures. This is a businesses for social responsibility graphic that I grabbed, and it basically just shows markets and payments for ecosystem services around the globe. The idea is to show you that there's a wide variety of activity going on. It's, you know, we track the markets and they're rapidly changing. It's a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week job to keep track of what's going on. And so to sort of make it a little bit more manageable, and actually it's not really us that is dividing it up this way. It's sort of the consumers of the information tend to look at markets by these divisions: biodiversity, water, and forest carbon. So by biodiversity market, we mean a payment for species protection or habitat conservation. For water, it's pretty clear, it's payments for water quality, supply, or flow regulation. And for carbon, it's sequestration or reduced emissions. And we look more closely at forest carbon than the larger carbon markets, because we're interested in ecosystem-based carbon, basically. And I should say, actually, maybe it's interesting that obviously these ecosystem services overlap spatially, and there's a lot of overlap in the actual ecosystem services. In the payments for ecosystem services, the markets, there's not so much overlap. They tend to be sort of divided, and that's a whole nother can of worms. It's really interesting, but it's a big conversation, is the stacking and bundling of the ecosystem service payments and how to do it. So biodiversity markets, this is a map taken from our State of Biodiversity Markets report. It shows biodiversity markets across the map. The probably hotspots are US and Australia, with Europe showing a lot of interest. We're tracking 45 active programs and 27 in development. And that's up, the active programs are up from 39 in 2010. And we are seeing a market size of 2 to 4 billion. That's a pretty wide range, and that is probably a conservative number. It's very hard to get dollar figures on a lot of these markets. A big chunk of that market size is the US mitigation banking market, or actually mitigation market, not just the credit banking. And some examples of what are included, what we call biodiversity payments, biodiversity markets, include conservation banking or wetland mitigation banking in the US, impact mitigation in Germany. Australia has done a lot of advanced thinking on market mechanisms, although they're relatively new in implementation. So they've done a great job of sort of thinking big about how to do these markets, but it still sort of remains to be seen how they work out. And they're actually quite fragmented. A lot of different initiatives in different territories or states that are not necessarily coordinated. So these are watershed markets. It doesn't quite show it here, but there's a lot going on in Latin America for PWS, payment for watershed services. Again, quite a bit of activity. There are a total of 225 programs. That's up from 127 in 2009. That is, that's a pretty big jump, and it's probably in part and our refined ability to actually find out about some of these programs. That's another challenge in gathering this information. But there's definitely been an increase in interest around watershed markets. The market size is 9 billion in 2008. We're in the midst of doing a new state of watershed payments report, and we'll have new numbers hopefully by the end of the year. I should point out that 9 billion is a very large chunk of it. Probably about 7 billion of it are China's eco-compensation programs that are watershed oriented. And so here are some examples of what we're tracking in the watershed markets. Australia has a pretty interesting salinity trading, and then Kenya's green water credits are relatively new. I don't know too much about them yet. Water quality trading in the US. So then to move on to forest carbon markets, these are forest carbon projects. This is a little bit different than the other two maps that I showed you, which were more sort of mapping the programs. This is mapping just singular forest carbon projects. So that's why there's quite a few. There's a total of 412. That's up from 312 in 2010. And the market size is 178 million, and that's obviously is a very thin slice of the larger carbon markets of what is it, $142 billion. And that does not include RED funds, because it's not quite clear yet whether RED is going to be market-based or not. If you were to include dispersed RED fund, UN RED funds, that would be about 430 million. And I think there's something like 7 billion committed for RED funding through UN RED. But that remains to be seen whether that's market-oriented. So what we do include are things like California's cap and trade program, which seems to be gaining some steam now. New South Wales greenhouse gas abatement program, some Kyoto CDM projects, and just sort of over-the-counter purchases, retail purchases. So let me sort of shift gears here a little bit, and with that as sort of an overview of what we see happening, try to pull out some of the patterns that hopefully will be helpful in thinking about how market-based mechanisms for ecosystem services work. So first, we see a spectrum of drivers ranging from voluntary to compliance. The voluntary side of things that are driven by reputational and material risk management. And on the other side, the driver is a response to law and regulation. But it's interesting, in between there's some gray areas where you have some payments and transactions driven by third-party policy. An example would be IFC's Performance Standard 6, where the loans are contingent on achieving those performance standards, and that I mention that because those are sort of still very young, but we have an idea that they will drive a bit of a biodiversity offset payment market. And then, of course, as you move towards compliance, you get into pre-compliance, where it's driven, where sort of markets or payments are driven by first mover advantage and the idea of not being surprised by policy when it does arrive. There is also a spectrum of instruments that we are seeing, ranging from sort of polluter pays principle to beneficiary pays principle. And very clearly on the polluter pays side are offsets and offset credit banking. As you move away from that, you get into sort of compensation funds where the actual impact and the conservation gain is not necessarily measured clearly, but there is an effort to make a compensation. I tend not to be a huge fan of those, although they probably have their time and place depending on the ecological, social, and economic conditions. Then PES, the sort of standard payment for ecosystem services scheme, you get more towards the beneficiary pays. That's where either the government and or nonprofit organizations help set up payment systems to reward the stewards of ecosystems and the services provided. And that's more, that's taxpayer / government and NGO paying for the service. So that's a little bit closer to beneficiary pays. And then you get into self-organized deals like Mineral Waters company paying for, or Puma paying for something upstream that they're using. And then certified ag or certified green certified products is clearly the beneficiary paying. Now, I also wanted to sort of point out some enabling conditions for markets. This is all these sort of pattern. I'm a little bit sensitive because all these pattern slides are pretty much an oversimplification, but I think they're illustrative. It may be helpful to think of it this way. There are definitely other necessary conditions for market-based instruments, but these are some of the big ones. Obviously, supply and demand is critical, but not just having them, but understanding what they look like. For example, in demand, understanding the spatial demand, supply and demand is important, especially if you're thinking about things like offset credit banking, where for carbon it's not such a big deal because you can make an impact and mitigate anywhere, on totally different ends of the globe. For biodiversity and water, there's a sort of a service area or they need to be spatially overlapping to have ecological significance, ecological meaning. So understanding basically the spatial and temporal shape of your demand and supply is critical. Governance and enforcement, that's an interesting one and important. Not only do you need strong to get to if you're going towards the compliance side of markets, you need strong, clear regulation, but without enforcement, the markets will fall flat. We've seen that happen even in situations where there's good regulation. If there's no enforcement, doesn't work. Transparent information, that's one that at the ecosystem marketplace, but that's what we focus on is clear and transparent information, available information to the idea there is to sort of reduce transaction costs and allow the not just those that can pay for analysis and information to be involved, the smaller landowners, and so that's a key one. And then property rights, service providers. You'll need. There's a lot of intermediaries that are necessary to make the markets work. I won't go too far into property rights. That's obvious. Oh wow! I didn't know that made a little bum. It didn't do it on my computer. Risks and challenges. It's important to recognize that there are, markets can be challenging to work with, and these are some challenges that should probably be addressed or at least considered during any sort of design phase of development. An interesting one is negative perception of markets. I think that's a bit more of an issue, or I don't really know. It's sort of an issue in the U.S. From some conversations I've had. I think it's maybe a bigger issue in Europe and maybe and definitely in Australia. I know they've been struggling with sort of this license to trash perception of markets or sort of commoditization of nature concern. My thoughts there are in some cases those are valid concerns and that those need to be considered. I feel like in many cases it's sort of a failure of communication to communicate exactly what the mechanism is or what the idea is or what the baseline situation is. So basically that's important to address, and I think it can be addressed often through better communications, clear communications. Ecological performance, hinted at this. The idea that monitoring your ecological outcomes is obviously critical, but it's actually quite often marginalized or done not entirely properly, and that's because it's really complicated. The science behind measuring your ecological outcomes is confusing and it's very expensive. But that is critical for making sure that the markets work, and that's the end game right there. Transaction costs, that's key for allowing not just the big players to be involved in markets, but allowing the small landowners and the small businesses to be able to pay. If the transaction costs of getting into a market, of starting up a project are too high, only those with capital or access to capital will be able to participate, and that's at least from our perspective, that's not the goal. The goal is to allow a robust, vibrant market an efficient market to evolve. Market stability or instability, rather, is an interesting one, and I won't even pretend to know how to make that happen. But as we all know, markets are volatile and can fluctuate wildly, and that's a design consideration that we need to get right as we do this. And then additionality, leakage, permanence, that's one that we're all familiar with from the carbon world, and that's sort of circumstance specific, but my understanding is that sort of insurance products are getting pretty good at dealing with that. So if you take all those and add them together, the sort of understanding what the drivers are, what the possible instruments are, and what your local conditions and risks are, my thought is that you'll have a better idea of what your potential opportunities are in a specific location. That's a bit of an oversimplification. There's other circles that should go into that funnel, but these are some of the big ones that I thought would be good to point out for conversation's sake. And then just finally, I sort of did a very high-level overview, and I apologize if I didn't get down into the details enough of any one of these markets. I'd be happy to answer questions later. We also have a ton of material that gets into it, and it sort of falls into those three categories: biodiversity, water, and carbon. We produce basically reports on each of those annually, and we have portals that track, show the projects and actually have project profiles and more detailed information. So thank you.